Well, hey everybody, it's Ryan,
Alfonso.
and we're back for another episode of Eating with the King. We actually just had Bible study this morning, so off camera is a good friend of ours, Nolan Dill, and these guys pounded half a dozen donuts this morning. I had one. I'm almost 43. If I eat 3 donuts, I'm gonna gain 8 pounds. I don't know how they did it, but it made me long for the days of when I was like 25, 26 and could eat whatever I want. But I do that now and I look like a basketball afterwards. Um, so hey, I think it's our 7th episode. Nolan told us he thinks it's number 7. So, but we've had a couple of weeks off where my schedule's been a little nuts and. So that's on me, but we're kind of, as the fall kicks off, we're just trying to get into a new schedule. So we're still planning on cutting more episodes, and I know, as a little tease for the future, you're a recent seminary grad, so we're gonna talk about that experience, but not today.
Yeah.
So today we're gonna just kind of talk about a couple of things in particular. One is kind of maybe most specifically is just kind of the time frame we're in right now of the temperature of what's going on in America and just kind of your observations of kind of what you're seeing, but then also just the experience of you being in the context you are in the town that you are, kind of juxtaposed from where you're from, and so we're gonna kind of talk about those two things together here today. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Great.
So which one do you want to tackle first, do you think? Would you want to talk about, because they kind of dovetail a little bit, but I don't know. I just want to make sure we set this up well. What do you think would be best?
Don't really matter.
Okay.
Let's just go for it.
All right. So why don't we hit on just kind of your experience in Bowling Green so far, and then I would like to maybe transition on the back half of this in terms of just the cultural moment we're in, and kind of, is it dying down or is it still going, and what are you seeing? So maybe we talk about just kind of your upbringing and where you're at today. I know we've hit on this a little bit in prior episodes, but I just think it's unique that you find yourself in kind of small town Midwest USA, and that's not exactly where you're from. So can maybe share a little bit about where you're from, and then we'll talk about maybe how it's uniquely different than where you're at today.
So, and I think in maybe episode 1 I mentioned I'm from South Bend, Indiana, pretty much in the inner city, kind of urban. And grew up in a predominantly black church. Even though what's interesting is that the city of South Bend, in my opinion, is fairly diverse overall as like a whole. Even though that there's like pockets, as in most cities, where there's certain demographics in just certain areas. So like I grew up in a place where like there was like a section of town not too far from where I lived that would have been considered like Little Mexico. So it's like a huge population of the Latino, and then many other places, you have different populations everywhere. So it's fairly diverse overall, but I grew up in a church that most people look like me, and I think that was one of the things that really had an impact on how I view church, especially when I came to BG. Yeah. And I know I always talk about stories when people ask me like, what was the transition like, because and I will say this too, in black churches and their experiences, for some they may be different from others. Sure. So obviously, like not every church is going to be the same, but there would probably be some similarities to some degree. And so the church I grew up in, and I talking about things that you miss. I missed a different style of preaching that I saw. Even though I'm not saying that was any better or worse than the preaching style that I see today, and even some of what I adopted, but I just remember the times when the pastor got going, there's a little bit of hooting going on. If you want to know what hooting is, you have to go look that one up. It'll be a nice time of research for you. And when the pastor have his towel, need some water, wipe off the sweat.
Yeah.
The people in the congregation in the middle of a sermon, tons of feedback and response, which we had a conversation once, and you were saying you wouldn't preach at a pretty much a black church, and the response pretty much kind of fired you up a little bit.
Yeah, it was Shiloh First Baptist in Buffalo, or I think First Baptist Shiloh, but it was I wasn't ready for it, and I just, by the end of it, I just like, I'm feeling pretty good, but that's not my common experience, so it was very unique.
Yeah, so the experiences can be different in many ways. People just praising God, and I tell stories of people taking victory laps around the church in the middle of a sermon when the Spirit of God is just hitting people, and the experience is definitely different. But one of the things that I was just thinking about, even as I'm like thinking about my experiences then versus now, the one thing that you do see in common, even though there might be some differences in like theology, is that you could see there are definitely people with a genuine love for God, and I think that today what we have to do is especially within the church, whether we're talking about here in Bowling Green, even back where I'm from, anywhere across the country, is one, I'm really huge on sound doctrine. So that's like the first, is like making sure no matter what realm you come from, that you're listening and adhering to sound doctrine and truth, and preaching what's actually in the scriptures. So that's first.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing that really hits home for me is having people who genuinely like actually want to love God in their expression, and not shame other people when their expression of loving Christ isn't sinful.
Yeah.
And being able to celebrate the cultural differences.
Yeah.
This podcast, Eating with the King, which is like this aspect of all of us, no matter who you are, where you come from, being able to sit and dine with Jesus. Yeah. In the expression in which God created you. Right, because you go back to Genesis 1 and you look at like everyone was given dignity as we were all created in God's image, right? So there are certain things that each and every one of us as individuals have, no matter the culture, that God will look at as like, this is good because I created it, and it wouldn't necessarily be sinful. And I think what, like, before I even dive in even deeper into other things, I think it would make most sense if we could understand how can we as a church of Christ in the world, in America, no matter where you are, be able to celebrate and enjoy the differences of how someone may worship when they aren't taking away from the gospel.
I think that's
and be unified in that. That is what I think about when I think about my experience from home, but then also when I think about my experience here. That's the one thing that I always thought about, especially over like the last couple of years, and even when this conversation even began back, first time I ever had this conversation with others was back in 2014. We were actually been on staff. You can talk about, we can get more into like other things, like how things have been going with our staff and things lately. But I remember as a student at BG, I had recently just came to the Lord. I was already a year in, and we went to this place. We did this thing called For Columbus. And I think that might have been with I don't even remember who we were with. Might have been North American Mission Board. I'm not even 100% sure with the partnership, but we went and was pretty much helping clean up the city and help out in Columbus. And I remember having a conversation during one of our lunch breaks with a couple of our pastors and people on staff about, man, like, dude, there's this huge divide in the church. We meet on campus, and there's predominantly of a white congregation. And then there's also another, student organization / church that's predominantly black. Like, what do we do? How do we bridge this gap? And there's just so many ways that conversation can go. But ever since then, I've really been thinking about all of this. And so, like, coming from, like, being here in Bowling Green, I didn't think about that at home, though. You get what I mean?
Sure, yeah.
Like, I didn't think about it at home until I left where I was and came here, and I realized it, like, oh man, this is like, seems like it could be a problem for the church in America in general, because there's just so much division that goes on in those realms. And so those are just like some initial thoughts that I had.
No, there's a few things that you pointed to that I think are really, really important for those that are watching. One is, I think, the richness of the perspective that God has given you. You know, by the fact that His sovereign hand took you out of a context and placed you into one that was very different. It affords you the opportunity to start saying some things that maybe not all of us are awake to. And I think specifically, you just talk about, hey, that experience back in South Bend was biblical, and that experience in Bowling Green is biblical. But collectively, when you see the full picture, then that's really biblical. Meaning, there are people from different parts of the world that are going to gather in different places, and even though it's not the full representation of the multicultural picture, but when you start going around the world and you start seeing different places in the world, like you've had the opportunity to experience that, like you start to appreciate that at a deeper level. And not everybody has. I know for me, it had a little bit to do with that. Like when I started to spend some time in non-white churches in Buffalo. But to be honest, like there were two bigger things. Was I started traveling overseas, and I started seeing the church all throughout the world. And I can remember I was in. So this wasn't even a racial difference. This was a cultural difference. I'm in the middle of the back roads of Ukraine, and I show up to this addiction center where people have been miraculously healed from addiction through the scriptures. And I don't understand a word that anybody's saying. I'm Russian by nationality, like by ethnicity, but the Ukrainians don't like the Russians. That's a newsflash, right? So, people know my last name, but they're kind of like, well, that's a Russian last name, but they're like, I'm looking at this going, this isn't about a black and white thing. This is about a language thing. It's about a cultural thing. And those people deeply love Jesus. They were highly Pentecostal, and I didn't understand a ton of what was going on, but it enriched my perspective of, I think this is biblical. I think this is what we're talking about. And the second thing was I was really turned on by this missiologist by the name of Dwight Smith, who, he talks about just the every man, woman, and child mantra that God wants for every man, woman, and child to have repeated opportunities to hear, see, and respond to the gospel. And I just remember one night I was watching a video of his, and he said, there's more Christians on the continent of Africa than there are human beings in the United States. And I don't know if you just stop yourself for a minute and think about that, and then start asking yourself, like, when we get to heaven, what is that going to look like? And the largest church in the world right now is Eastern, it's not Western. What is that going to look like? I don't think there's going to be as many white people. I mean, there's going to be white people dancing and celebrating the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, but it's going to be way more diverse. And I think, like, you've been given that opportunity to see that just in a microcosm, if you will. And so, can I ask a question around that?
Yeah, for sure.
Is it, and maybe this puts you on the spot, and I don't mean to, but is it hard sometimes when you feel like you've had that, but maybe you're in community with those who haven't? Is that difficult?
That's a great question. I mean, there have been moments where it has seemed difficult, but overall, I would say it's not really that difficult. And the reason I say that is because I've learned to appreciate, and I feel like I'm at a crossroads too. I'll just say that, because it's like, man, I saw the expression of the gospel look a little different growing up, and I don't get to see as much as that today. Like, I would love to hear a lot more call and response in the middle of a sermon.
I'll start doing that when you're preaching now. Amen, Pastor.
Yeah, like I would love that. But for me though, I've learned to, by the grace of God, to appreciate my context, because I know that the people I'm around genuinely love Christ, even though it may look different. And I think that, I think we just need more of that in some regards for many different people, to be like, depending on context, even though we might have certain preferences, be okay if we don't, if the things that we completely desire aren't actually what we see. Because that doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong. I feel like sometimes what happens is if we have a desire for something and we don't fully see it in a church context, which, because I mean, churches are filled with a bunch of people who need Jesus.
Yes.
Not a bunch of people who are Jesus. Let me just throw that out there. Right, a bunch of people who need Jesus. So because we all need Jesus and we're walking and trying to follow Christ, what that means is that there's going to be some flaws in us that He's going to be continually working out, and so we're not going to always get it right. That's just what it is. I don't know. Like, if somebody knows if you know a perfect church in America, please let me know. I would love to go visit.
Yeah.
But it's like, so because like there's not like this perfect church, and there's a bunch of people stumbling and walking, trying to figure this thing out of what does it look like for us to like love Christ with everything that we have, love His Word, to commune with Him, be in community, and to repent and confess. What happens is you have this picture of people who aren't getting it right. So your church might not look exactly how you completely desire it, but that doesn't always necessarily mean that something is wrong.
Right.
And so we can be okay with that in some regards. Now, unless like your church is completely missing something that's in the scriptures that is a command.
Yeah.
Like, right. So it's like if you are meeting in a church that never takes communion, I think that at that point your church is completely wrong, and you might either want to say something to those leading, or you might want to leave. That's just like, because that's something that's commanded. But like if there's things in there that are just like they're not as black and white, they're a little bit gray, I think we can be comfortable with if those things aren't happening. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But in some cases though, and this goes into a whole nother discussion, like when you think about churches and like how do we appeal to different populations of people, like when it comes to reaching them for the gospel, you always got to go back to really wanting to study 1 Corinthians 9 when Paul's like, to the Jew I became a Jew, to the weak I became weak, and pretty much saying I did all these things in order to that I might save some to reach all men. So it's like he's talking about this level, and I've used this section because every time I listen and I read it, I'm just like, this took a lot of intentionality to be able to reach people who are different. So it's like, how can we appeal? So there might be times in your church, it's like, man, there are people in our communities that we aren't reaching. And some of that may be because we are actually stepping into trying to understand those people where they are and meet them where they are with the truth of the gospel, you know?
That's good.
And so overall though, like to answer your question in full, like, I mean, I sometimes miss those things. Is it hard at times? Yeah, every now and then.
Yeah.
But I've also been very grateful for the community that I'm in.
Yeah.
Like I just have, even with brothers and sisters who look different than me.
Yeah.
Come from different places than me. And it's been something that I've had a lot of peace about, because my experience is just different than some. Especially some black Christians, and I can say this: there have been some Christians who are black that might be in contexts where they don't feel appreciated at all, and I haven't had that experience here.
Yeah.
I've definitely felt appreciated. Have there been moments where I might have felt misunderstood? Or yeah, there have been sometimes, but overall though, I feel like I'm definitely appreciated here on so many different levels by everyone that I encounter.
Yeah.
People that are thankful, that tell me like, hey, I'm thankful that you're around. So that's like my overall picture. I hope that answers the question.
Oh, that's great, man. It's one, I'm encouraged that you feel that way. I know, I mean, I can speak for a lot of people. I shouldn't, but I will. And I appreciate having you. I mean, it's been a joy. I mean, I came to Bowling Green a couple years ago, just candidly very burned out from ministry, and so in some ways I feel like God threw me a friendship lifeline with you, early on, and it's a joy to kind of see it unfold a little bit more. I'm still working through my own stuff, but it's just been fun. It's been fun to have you in my life, and it's been fun to just see God at work in your life in our church, and I think that's really huge. So
Appreciate it, man.
yeah. we're in a really interesting moment right now in America. The political heat is 10 out of 10. It's an election year. The DNC is going right now. It's just intense right now. And one of the things I was curious about is, and we kind of talked a little bit off camera about this, but I was just really interested in how you're feeling about maybe like twofold. Like, what are you seeing? What are you recently observing? Like sometimes like a national event happens and then it dies out around race and around the desire to like, let's get some healing here. I'd love to hear your perspective on that, and then maybe we can close out the morning with maybe how you're feeling about, because it sounds like there's some real positive things that you're seeing even within your staff, your teammates, and I think that's super encouraging to hear. So, would you be willing to share just a little bit more about like how do you, like, given what's going on in America, and given the tension of what happened a few months ago and where we're at today, some people are like, well, it's just dying down, it's going to go away. What are your thoughts? Like, what are you seeing today?
Yeah, I mean, in just my slight observations, it seems as though even though coronavirus has taken over, still it hasn't gone away. Even though that's on the forefront of people's minds, I sense that there still has been a lingering of people still wanting to talk about race and racial reconciliation and how do we build bridges with those who are different than us. And I think even though there have been some cases in some churches where people have, kind of swept that under the rug, or people have been indifferent towards it and haven't maybe dealt with it, I think in some cases what I've been seeing is there are people who are still having this conversation, which is like, I think, a blessing from God in the churches in which people are genuinely looking to the scriptures as how do we actually live out the unity and oneness that the scriptures share with us, and that God is teaching us. And so I'm definitely seeing that in some cases where people are still wanting to talk about it. So like even like Mason's church right now is doing like this whole cancel culture series, and one of the ones he recently just preached on, which is like just last week, was about like what I mean when I say Black Lives Matter kind of thing, and pretty much preaching out of Genesis. But so like you see that there's even moments like that's just one isolated example, but there are definitely others where people are talking about this still. Like we had at our Blitz conference last week, we had a panel talking about this conversation, having this conversation again with all of our students in front of us. So I think that it's still going on, but I also think too at the same time, even as this is still going on in the church, this is like people on the outside that might not be Christians are still talking about this. And I know I was sharing the story, but I recently went to Wisconsin, Madison, never been there before in my life, went to visit some friends, and we were walking down State Street. It's one of like the main places there, and the reason why I think that this conversation is still going on even outside of the church is because there are still people fighting for whether it's power, that's just being honest, whether it's power, equity, equality. I don't like, people have different agendas. And so people might still be fighting for this, because this is if there's a time to go fight for it and you're not a Christian, it's probably right now. I mean, you can see that in many different places. But as we were there, one of the things that I saw, and this plays part into why I think it's still going on, is the effect that a lot of the protests and riots in some of the major places had. And so as we were walking, dude, there's boarded up buildings, restaurants are still closed because of it. I don't even think it's COVID related. Like there's literally like wood plastered in windows, and there's graffiti and spray paint everywhere, messages about Black Lives Matter everywhere. I mean, it was just like crazy. And then we even saw a group of people whom I couldn't tell whether or not they were maybe Black Lives Matter people, maybe with the organization. I don't necessarily know who it was, but they were outside of a place, sitting down in the middle of the street, listening to something from Richard Nixon. Now, what that means, I have no idea.
What is going on here?
But they were all dressed in black, and it seemed like they were fighting for something. What it was, I have no idea exactly what. But it seems as though, like, even though overall, generally, when you go open up social media, it's died down a little bit. But this is the thing, we live in a time where social media and just news outlets in general perpetuate things.
Yeah.
And so, when you hear about that next isolated incident of a person who loses their life, and people want justice, and then, people want to bring in other things, this conversation is still going on. Because, division is a real thing.
Yeah. Real quick, I just want to put a plug out there because you mentioned Eric Mason's church, Epiphany in Philadelphia. I would put just a loving plug out there for anyone who is wanting to hear, in terms of theologically tight and right perspective on a conversation like this. Eric Mason's a great person to be listening to right now. And he has had some really key relationships throughout the United States that he's poured into. Doug Logan, who's I think in Richmond, Virginia, if I'm not mistaken now. He was in Camden, but he's helping to lead up Grimke Seminary. Charlie Mitchell, who's at Epiphany Baltimore, and Derek Parks, who's at Epiphany Wilmington. These are friends of mine that I've had a chance to interact with over the years. But I would strongly encourage, if you'd like to hear more about some good sermons around conversations like this, I think there's a lot of value in taking a look at the Epiphany network of churches. Philly, Camden, Baltimore, Wilmington. I'm sure there's others, but those are the ones that I've had a relational connection to. So anyway.
Yeah.
Let's transition real quick, because I know I want to be sensitive to our time, but and thanks for sharing.
Yeah, for sure.
And I feel like I want to be sensitive to not like, hey, you're an African American, just give me the African American perspective on everything. I feel like you're great to like, hey, this is my view, and so hopefully that's coming through, because I feel like you're very sensitive to that, and it's one of the things I really appreciate about you. It seems like you're encouraged by some of the stuff happening on your team here at BGSU. And I would love to hear, like, one, it's always good to celebrate wins.
Yeah.
So it sounds like there's some positive things happening with your team, the staff here at BGSU. Would you be willing to share a little bit about that?
First, I want to just say thank you to our staff. If you ever get a chance to listen to this is me just telling you thank you. I've been very appreciative of my love that you've shown me in the middle of all of this stuff, even when tensions are flaring all across the country, and there are many people, even church leaders, who aren't handling this right and aren't really being sensitive or understanding or loving to their brothers and sisters who are different than them. Doesn't even always have to mean black and white. It can mean in many other ways, right? And so I am very thankful. So I want to say that. And then the other side of it is, what I've noticed is that so many people on our staff, especially when all this stuff started, have been really just in a place where everyone is like approaching this in like humility, and it seems like I want to understand and love better so that I can reach more people for the gospel better. And it's been like really cool. Like I said, last week I had continued the conversation with another panel with our students, which I think was a huge win.
So just like a panel discussion with some of the student leaders at BGSU.
Yeah, so it was me and then Brian and Matt
That's good.
and McClure, and we were just having this conversation, and our students were listening, and I think it was just good to just let them know that like we care about wanting to bring unity to the body of Christ on many levels, and ethnicity / race is included in that. And I think it has to be, especially when you go look at the scriptures and it's clear as day that there were people from different ethnic groups throughout the Bible. Like, it's very clear, and we understand that it's very clear that Christ came to save all of those people, and that when you go look at the scriptures, it's also clear that Christ wants unity between all of those people. And so I think that's what we are just trying to communicate, and they've done a really good job of wanting to press that forward. And then even then, like on our staff, we're going to be reading A Color Compromise by Jemar Tisby, which is going to be a very interesting book and challenging book for some. Just as like when you're reading any book written by a human being, right? Like you have to understand the balance and tension of like, okay, do I take this and I say that this is completely right, or do I look at it as like, oh, I might not actually agree with that, but maybe these things that I disagree with can maybe strengthen me or help me or convict me in certain different ways. And so I think it's going to be a really great opportunity, and that's just that in and of itself, wanting to read that as a staff,
that's pretty cool.
It's like a really cool picture of just
awesome.
What does it look like for us to learn about the history of America, especially within the church, of how slavery and racism and discrimination has been perpetuated even from Christians throughout history, because that's kind of what the book is centered on, which is a huge step. And the reason I say that is because we live in a place today in this country where there have been people who have no idea of how deep these things run and why it looks the way it does today. It's just like, when people, I think about, we were talking earlier about just the heart of sin, and listening to Keller, which I love Keller, and it's like people have sin like deep within their hearts, but there are definitely moments when you don't really understand the ramifications and the depths of it until the way it comes out in their life later. And so when I think about like slavery in America and like the way that actually carried itself, it shows that it's rearing its ugly head right now, and like how deep that actually went. And so to take the time to go and learn about that so that you can understand and learn people that you can go live out 1 Corinthians 9 is a huge picture of just like what we want for people in Christ, is to be able to understand those who are different, that we might go and apply the gospel the way that they need it. And so the staff has been great with that. They've been loving with that, and we've had many good conversations, and where I've gotten to learn from them. They're learning from me, and that's just what it takes to live this out. And it's all about relationship building amongst people who are humble.
Well, that even goes back to what we were listening to this morning in the Keller sermon. Like, community, like if you want to know Jesus, you've got to do it in the context of community.
Have to.
And because there's just like the push and the pull and the sharpening, together. Those things are all massive.
And I think you might have said this. So you could
if it's good, I'm going to take credit for it.
Like you can either correct me or maybe explain more. But like this picture of like in Keller, it came from off of what Keller said, because he's like, if you can tell a person who has really encountered Jesus by the way that they approach wanting to know Jesus through community and live out the gospel in community. And then when you were talking, you started to talk about how like that part that Keller mentioned reminds us of this whole conversation today. You want to talk a little bit about that real quick?
It's one of those things, like, the reality is, I think that when you try to pick up a conversation as volatile as this, you can just go to social media and watch people try to have a conversation about this. And it's intense, and it's not always positive. It's not always constructive. It's there's a lot of hurt underneath it, and there's and sometimes there's a lot of maybe perhaps prescribing solutions that are uninformed. Meaning, you've not actually walked in community with someone who doesn't look like you, but you're offering solutions as to this is how to fix the problem, and yet you've never been in community. So my prescriptive above that is walking in community with people that don't necessarily look like you, but having the common thread of submitting your life to Jesus. And I do, one of the things that's been hard for me, and I think this is what I was talking about earlier, is I just think that there are some people that, Matthew 7 talks about the narrow road of Christianity, the way, right? That at the summit of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is like, hey, by the way, it's a real narrow road, and not many of you are going to be on it. And you're like, what? Wait, I just heard the greatest sermon of my life, and wait, it's a narrow road. And so what I was trying to say is I do think that there are some people that are saying I'm following Jesus, but I don't know that there's a lot of fruit of that backs up that statement. And inclusive within that is I don't know that it's being walked out in community. Because I think community it grounds you, it humbles you, it sharpens you, it makes you more self-aware than at any point where you could be as an individual, because people love you enough to call you on things or to point out things. And gang, I'm coming off the heels of 3 very important people in my life just a week ago sitting me down and saying, I love you enough to tell you this is something I see in your life. I think you need some help. That's hard to hear, but it was necessary to hear, and they were right, and I needed some help, and so I couldn't get that without community. So I think that's what I was hitting at.
Yeah,
so.
man, which is good.
Yeah, yeah. Well, man, this is really good. I'm blessed by these conversations, and I know that it's going to take a while. Like, we're going to keep finding our voice and our path in this, but I am not at all, like 7 episodes in, I am not at all discouraged by what God has allowed us to, discuss and uncover. And, I'm really thankful for this friendship, and I'm thankful for the perspective and the maturity that God has given you, just as 2 normal people in a fairly insignificant town. Trying to have a meaningful conversation around things that really, I think, do matter deeply to the body of Christ. And so thank you so much for joining us today. And gang, we're going to be back hopefully next week, and we'll be probably talking a little bit about your experience in seminary. I think we'll put that ball on the tee and see how that conversation goes. So gang, thanks for joining us today. God bless you. God be with you. And we look forward to seeing you all again next week.
See you.